All right, today is August the 8th in 2026, and I'm here with my colleague, US lead Steve Martin. This is an important episode if you've been following the trajectory of Infinita on biotech acceleration. In this episode, we're going to talk all about the Montana pathway. Call it the ultimate guide to Montana SB535. SB535 is the new law in Montana that allows a new model for biotech acceleration and patient access. This is our new direction as a business and what we recommend right now for companies in biotech, longevity, and so on that have been following us for a while and are trying to figure out how to beat Irum's law, the reverse of Moore's law in biotechnology and in accelerating drug approval costs and timelines. So Montana is the next frontier in providing an answer to that question. It is a new model based in the United States. So how are we getting from that? How are we getting to that insight after having tried this in Prospera for more than 3 years? What is the pathway for companies and clinics to use Montana right now? Like, this will be an episode that will be very practical times. So if you're in biotech or if you're a physician, this is for you. And how do we get from there to larger adoption, to other US states, to international jurisdiction, to the FDA itself, maybe? These are the questions we'll answer today together. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me, Niklas. Appreciate it.
Sure. So Steve, do you want to give our listeners a bit of an introduction to yourself, maybe also starting with how we met? And I know you're someone who doesn't want to waste anyone's time, so you're always tempted to be very brief, but you have a very interesting background, so don't be shy.
Sure. So my name is Stephen Martin. I'm a US lead for Infinita, and as of about, I guess, like 11 days ago, I also now handle intake for both biotechs and clinics for Montana ETRB. That's Echo Tango Romeo Bravo. In terms of my personal story and how we met, I got started in all of this from the patient side. So I was not necessarily someone who was gung ho on like the economics of biotech or drug development or anything like that. I got started in all of this because I injured my spine. I herniated a few of the discs in my lumbar spine, recovered for about a year or two, and then re-herniated. And the second herniation was serious enough that I began to lose the use of one of my legs. And I was being told by basically everyone that I spoke to that it was time to do something about it, or I was risking potentially permanent damage. For those of you who don't know, spine surgery is a very risky process. Sorry, I'm getting some feedback from your side, just so you know, like the loop thing where my voice comes back to me like a half a second later.
Yeah, not sure how to avoid it.
Okay. Um, well, anyways, so after, here, I'll just mute that. So after being told that I needed to get surgery, I began kind of doing my own research and seeing if there was anything in the clinical pipeline that might prevent me from needing to get a risky surgery. And I found a few treatments. They were stem cell treatments, which showed promise in helping potentially like the body do its own healing for herniated or degenerated discs. And at the time I was very naive about all of the pre-approval access stuff. I thought, oh well, I've got right to try. Donald Trump signed that in 2018. One of these companies is headquartered in Utah, and look at that. They've got like their own state level stem cell access law. Beyond that, there's kind of expanded access options. So surely between all of these various options, surely I'm going to find some way to get a hold of one of these treatments. And then after just banging my head against it for as long as I could and putting out all the resources and time and effort into it that I could, I came to realize, wait a minute, none of these laws actually work. They all look good on paper. All of them seem like they're things you should be able to use to access treatments. And you look at things like right to try, it's a 100% approval rate. The FDA doesn't even have the authority to say no. And you look at expanded access, once you get to the point of submission, it's like a 99% approval rate. It's practically a rubber stamp. But then what people don't tell you is that there's practically no companies submitting. And then half the ones that do end up shuttering their program afterwards because it's not financially sustainable. So I did end up having the surgery, and it ended up being thankfully very successful. But it got me down this whole pathway of, this rabbit hole of wanting to know why doesn't this stuff actually work? Why does it all look so good on paper, but then when you actually try to go get treatment, none of these laws actually help? And it was in that context that I got introduced to you, Niklas, and started at first doing volunteering for Infinita, and then got brought on as an advisor, and then over time got more and more responsibilities because I guess I was doing a good job, and now functioning as a US lead. And yeah, that's kind of the broad background and the story.
Yeah, doing a good job is understating it. You've been an instrumental piece to building this, which is now the main direction of everything we do. And there is a very particular background that you have that was really a key missing piece, like very specific expertise that you developed there that is kind of very analogous to what we're doing right now. Can you talk a bit about that at the business you built before?
Sure. So, in a previous life, I did intellectual property licensing and I guess what you could call like litigation finance. And in particular, I worked in the U.S. Legal cannabis industry. And you know, I started a company called Gene Pool Technologies, which basically went out and took a very contrarian bet on intellectual property law in the U.S. cannabis industry. So, IP law around patents is federal law. It is enforced in federal courts. You speak to federal judges. You use like the Book of Federal Law, that kind of thing. The U.S. cannabis industry is obviously in a unique legal twilight where federally it is illegal, but it is granted enforcement discretion from folks like DOJ and DEA. And on the state level, it is legal. And when I entered the U.S. cannabis industry at the time, the going line around intellectual property was that because all of this is federal law and because all of this subject matter is federally illegal, it is actually, you don't have to license patents. It's not necessary. You can just infringe patents and you can't be sued in federal court. The idea was that a judge will never reward what is technically federally illegal drug money as a damages judgment or as a patent royalty, right? I and a few others took the stance that did not pass the smell test, right? The idea that the U.S. government was going to say that you can manufacture like Viagra, but if you put enough molecules of THC in it, you don't have to pay royalties, or that you can just like steal equipment that was like custom made by Boeing, and there's nothing they can do about it if it's used to make cannabis products. None of that really made any sense, and so we put together some of our own capital. We purchased a few patent families and then took them out and enforced them with the goal of setting precedent that, yes, in fact, you could use federal law to regulate a state level market on an intellectual property side, and that this like separation, this imagined separation where there was no interaction because of like the lack of explicit federal legality was not real. And as a result, all of these IP assets were extremely undervalued. And in, I think, late 2025, a long time after we got started, we finally won our first verdict in the Central District of California, and we showed that yes, you can take a federally illegal cannabis company to court, to federal court over IP law, and you can enforce against them, and you can compel the payment of damages and royalties. So it's only a little bit analogous in that there are these state level laws like we see in Montana, and there are these like federal regulations and these federal laws. And I guess you could say that I have consistently thought that the sort of ambiguities and the ability to predict how these systems would interact was not as difficult as most people thought they would. And I think that does inform some of my attitudes as to how biotechs can treat these state level laws. I think that it's not as complex or difficult to understand of a picture as a lot of attorneys will advise you, just like they would have advised you that they couldn't predict the outcome of a patent case in cannabis, when in fact it was a very predictable thing. And yeah, that's kind of how my particular background, working in the intersection of federal and state regulation, informed the right to try stuff that I do now.
Yeah, so there's like a very specific, all right, the state and federal law interactions, right? And to give a bit of background how I came to that, right? So I got involved in the Montana legislation around December 2024, right? And it was already in Prosper at the time. And we're trying to bring biotech companies here, and we have brought some companies. Unlimited Bio, for example, is currently doing clinical trials on AAV follistatin gene therapy. We also kind of learned how long it takes, right? Because there's not a lot of medical infrastructure here. And also then the question is, what happens after, right? So, okay, say you get good data in Prospera and you do some early commercialization. Well, what does it get you? Who else is accepting that data? Is it transferable? And we couldn't answer that because it would be a guess whether or not the FDA would accept the data from an offshore jurisdiction with kind of a very novel kind of regulatory structure based on a special economic zone. So we kind of realized we had to find an alternative, right? So people were very excited about the project and about sort of using sort of new regulatory and early access clinical pathways to accelerate biotech. And there's a very deep need. And that's when we kind of I stumbled on Montana. So Dylan Livingston from the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives had passed a law before, SB422, with Ken Bogner, the senator of Montana, right? So through a serendipitous circumstance, but informed kind of by the needs of what the longevity community had around aging not considered disease, which meaning you needed a more preventative approach. And that led to that law, SB 422, which made basically any patient eligible under right to try, versus under traditional right to try, where you need to have a life-threatening disease, right? So with longevity, the approach is, okay, we can treat diseases before they happen. We have a preventative, a precision, and personalized medicine approach. So I was interested in that. I heard Ken Bogner speak at some conferences, and then I looked into it, and I was like, this is really powerful. And it was at the time, and it's still not used, right? So I was asking myself, or Ken Bogner, in fact, actually offered me come out to Montana and I introduce you to people. So I was meeting businesses there, I was meeting universities, I was meeting clinicians, and there was just a very strong appetite, a willingness to do business. And Ken Bogner basically asked me, well, what else do we need to do, right? How does the law need to look like to bring you and the biotech companies that you're talking to, right? So we had invested in some companies at that point, and we had several biotechs in our ecosystem. And sort of the result of this was a collaboration that led to, with several other people, to SB532, 535. And the idea was pretty much, all right, there was kind of one more key bottleneck that we needed to remove, which was basically, and you're going to talk more about that, but it was the potential reward for companies, right? So under traditional right to try, they were not allowed to make a profit. Like you had to basically charge at cost. So SB 535 removed that. And then the idea was on top of that, all right, so we don't want this to be a one-off. We want this to be something that can be acceptable in other US states as well, and that we eventually could also put in front of the FDA and saying, hey, this benefits everyone. This is also beneficial for the public health mission that you're under. And as a result, the idea was we actually make it a tight regulatory framework, a clear pathway. So the result of this were the experimental treatment centers, so a specialized license, and the ETRBs, the experimental treatment review boards, so similar to federal IRBs, which are oversight boards with scientists and with medical practitioners that review treatments before they're admitted. And that's when you got involved. So, Steve, what was your thinking when you were kind of seeing this sort of embryonic state of development of the Montana law, plus what we've done in Prosper at this point, and what is our insight now, and how Montana can kind of overcome the problems that federal right to try or the state right to try in other states is facing?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is that and again, I come at this from the perspective of someone who is trying to access this stuff, right? So for me, what the biotechs need is a secondary question to like, what does the patient need? But they are linked, right? The patient is not going to get what they need unless the biotech and the clinics and everybody else get what they need. All of the problems with pre-approval access systems generally, whether you're looking on a state level, whether you're looking on a federal level, all boil down to very poor risk reward. I need to turn the volume to zero every single time because I just can't. Um, oh yeah, I think if you mute your side, that would work. Uh, all of the right to try and expanded access systems, whether it's on a federal or state level, do prohibit any sort of pricing at a profit whatsoever. And the idea behind all of this is that that is somehow creating like this moral hazard, which makes providing pre-approval access unacceptable, and that you should be able to see enough upside for biotechs from the gathering of real world evidence and real world data, which they should, in theory, be able to use to get increased investor attention. They should be able to take it to the FDA and argue for things like fast track status or use it for various other purposes, right? So the idea is, okay, we're not going to let you make a profit, but we are going to let you gather all of this data and use that data. The problem is that there is a breakdown between the theory and the practical reality that biotechs face. One, on the upside from the data side, the real world evidence and real world data, the process of converting that into either investor capital or some sort of accelerated approval status from the FDA is not certain and it's not quick. And the problem is also that when you go and do this pre-approval access stuff, you have immediate upfront costs that you need to cover. The way that at cost is calculated under these systems, the reality is you are going to lose money with every single patient that you treat. So you are effectively paying to generate that data, and the cost is quite high. And then perhaps more importantly, you're taking enormous risk. Whenever you treat somebody in a pre-approval setting, there is a higher than average chance that things will go wrong. This is especially relevant in fields like oncology, where by the time someone is using like a pre-approval access pathway, like expanded access or right to try, they're usually on their last rope. The chances that something will go wrong with them as a patient, even if your treatment works phenomenally, is actually pretty high. And in the long term, you may find that like when that happens and the investigation is all done, you're totally cleared because it was nothing to do with your drug. But just the headline of, oh, these guys treated a patient under right to try or under expanded access, and then the patient got seriously sick or even died, just that headline could be enough that the next time you need to go raise capital and some investor Googles you and that's the first thing that they read, even if ultimately you were like exonerated, just that reputational hit is like a potentially catastrophic risk, especially for a small biotech that needs to raise another round to survive. So the only way that you can offset all of this risk is with sufficient reward. And again, in theory, the data is supposed to be the reward, but in reality, it's just not that valuable. So what you need is for biotechs to be able to get actual monetary upside, not hypothetically at some point in the future when they sell at a higher valuation, but immediately, both so that they can cover their upfront costs and also so that they can justify taking the various risks required to provide pre-approval access generally. And that's why it is important, and that's why the only way that you can have an actual scalably functioning pre-approval access system is to allow biotechs and clinics and everyone else like that to price at whatever price they need in order to justify taking the risk.
Yeah, I would do a slight correction. I wouldn't say that data isn't necessarily that valuable, but the fact that you can do for-profit or flexible payment modalities also allows you to get data more cheaply. And when data is cheap and you can collect a lot of it, it's actually very valuable,
Yeah,
right? So,
I'm not arguing that it's not valuable. I'm just saying that data in and of itself, we have seen this. Like there's too many right to try programs, there's too many expanded access programs not getting off the ground, even though they provide a way to get data. We can't ignore the fact that data in and of itself is not going to be enough to justify uh, making the investment and taking the risks that come in hand with providing scalable pre-approval access. Like it just the evidence at this point is too clear. You also need to supplement it with like the ability for that actual data generation to not break the bank at the very least.
yeah. So let's be very specific. What is the value proposition, or what can the different stakeholders do right now in Montana? Meaning specifically biotechs, but could also be bigger farmers, clinicians and physicians and patients.
Yeah. So I'll give you a few use cases that we've actually seen so far. One, let's say that you're a biotech and you have finished your phase 1 or even your phase 2, but you haven't yet begun your phase 3, right? And you're thinking about, okay, what endpoint should I be arguing for my phase 3? This is a big decision. If you get that decision wrong, that could be the death of your company, right? You have to argue this efficacy, you have to show safety, all of these things. And there are a long history of companies who have, despite having a drug which works, just made that decision wrong and then died out. So you can come to Montana now and you can have a treatment protocol approved with our experimental treatment review board, which is live and running and actively doing reviews. And you can go out and treat patients and gather whatever data you need to internally de-risk your next phase of trials endpoints, right? There are basically zero limitations on what you can ask or even require that a patient do in order to make sure that you have all of the data you need. And then the idea is you're going to come out here, you're going to treat, let's say, a dozen or 50 or even 100 patients. That's going to give you the data you need to say, okay, we were thinking about these 3 potential endpoints. We can now look at this actual real world evidence done in a live setting, and we can kind of get a preview of what these clinical trial results are going to look like. And so we can choose the proper endpoint. And that's valuable for both the reason that you de-risked your own company's future, but also for the reason that you can go to private investors and say, hey, maybe you were worried our next phase is like kind of a big risky inflection point for the company. Well, look at this. It's actually been really substantially de-risked. We have a really good reason to say that we can now predict what our next phase trial is going to look like. So that's one pretty valuable use case. Another valuable use case is actually the creation of endpoints. So we have a company right now that is actually about to submit to the ETRB who have a problem where they have gone to the FDA and argued that they want to have their efficacy endpoints be tied to a specific outcome. And I'll keep it vague because I don't want to name drop them without their permission. But the FDA does not have an existing endpoint to measure this outcome. There's not really a dispute that the outcome is in fact occurring, but there is a problem of the FDA saying, well, how do we measure that? And then if you're in this company's position, you're in a bit of a catch-22 because the FDA is going to say, well, you need to bring us the data to show this is the proper way to measure it. And then you say, okay, how can I get that data? And they say, well, I don't know, figure it out. Good luck. Well, you can come to Montana, use your phase 1 results, and you can submit with a treatment protocol. And again, you can gather whatever data you need. All of this real world evidence is exactly the kind of thing that you're going to need to take to the FDA in order to say, okay, we want to measure X phenomenon occurring within the human body. We went and treated 100 patients. We biopsied them. We had them use wearables. We had them take surveys once a week for like a year, whatever it is. And here is all of this data, and this is why we're going to argue for this new endpoint for our next phase of clinical trials. And so you see like this Montana program where it's possible to do this in an economically scalable fashion can actually be the thing that generates the data to create these new endpoints. And I assume that for the average person listening to the podcast, you can immediately, because you are a fan of Infinita, you can immediately peg this to this could be a potential solution for the kind of lack of longevity endpoints, which are kind of plaguing the industry right now with the FDA. All you need to do is demonstrate that initial phase 1 safety profile, and then you can come to Montana and get the data that you need to go to FDA and argue, hey, here is what the longevity endpoints should be. Here is the actual 100 patient, 2-year real world evidence. And you can, in the process, also earn the funds that you need to potentially fund your phase 2 clinical trial, which Alex Tabarrok referred to as like kind of the idea of self-funding clinical trials. And of course, this is less important to the industry people, but ideologically very important to me. You can help a lot of patients who otherwise wouldn't be able to get access to your treatment. So this is how you can kind of kill multiple birds with the single stone that is Montana.
Yeah, I want to double down on that a little bit because it's so important, right? Because you're pointing at the key problem with sort of the very top-down regulatory approach to science in general, right? So you have a catch-22, right? Because you need to get data to better know what your endpoint is, right? And you need data to get more money and more funding in your NIH application or for your FDA clinical trial, right? But without the data, you don't get the funding, right? So that's a catch-22. You kind of need to know already what the research results are going to be before you do it to get funding, right? Versus in reality, science is better conceived as a continuous a bottom-up discovery process. Like you iterate, you learn, right? You discover something new. One conjecture that you found is showing wrong, and then you course correct and work on a different conjecture. And the key is for that process to be cheaper, right? So in all of basically innovation that uses the experimental method, progress often comes down to the cost of failure, right? We have to make a lot of failure and wrong conjecture to arrive at something that works. And the same should be true for clinical trials, right? This is like a perfect example, right? So maybe the point is not, as many people are often saying, oh, you should just have it tested in trials before you get it to patients. Yes, we need more data to do the better trials, right? Because these trials are so expensive. And maybe we even find out before a phase 2 or phase 3 trial that costs hundreds of millions, well, it doesn't work. This way, we're not overburdening the trial system with unnecessary costs or many patients with unnecessary hope, right? So this is really kind of a potential paradigm change in how we do science. Like instead of top down, more bottom up, but still in a controlled way with oversight and everything. And we'll get to that. But let's stick to, if you want to talk more about the biotechs or more use cases, or do you want to talk more about the patient in the clinic side?
I think that with the biotechs, like really the whole funding element is the only thing that I would double click on because we had this meeting June 18th with the FDA, right? And I think that it was very demonstrative of the kind of gap between the reality that biotechs face and sort of the attitude of a lot of like you might call it in like the Yarvin sense, like the cathedral of the FDA. When we talked about the funding realities and the economic realities, which prevent biotechs from generating the kind of real world evidence that is needed to actually push their stuff through the clinical trials, not just like, okay, what can we charge at cost, but also like, okay, what about all the things we can't charge at cost? Like, where does that money come from? The actual answer from the FDA, and I'm paraphrasing this, but it's as close to word as I can make it, is, well, I don't know what we're supposed to do about that. And, the answer is, well, if you're a biotech and you're wondering what you should do about that, it's come to Montana. Because if you come out here, you don't have to raise millions and millions of dollars to generate that data to justify your next phase of clinical trials, or even to fund your next phase of clinical trials. You can potentially just do what you need to do to get that initial manufacturing up and run and get that initial application in, which is like a grand total of like $12,000, and you can actually get off and going and get gathering that data. And you can do so not only truly breaking even on your costs, but even potentially putting away some money to fund that next phase of clinical trials. So you're not going to constantly be needing to raise investor capital just in order to survive. That is a big paradigm shift that is going to fundamentally change the way that drug development and discovery is done and financed in this country. And in the process, it's going to help dozens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of people who would have otherwise had no options.
And let's be very concrete when you're a biotech. What website do you go on and what do you fill out on that website? What do we help with and what do you need to figure out on your own to get the whole process started?
So the first step of the process, you're going to go to montanaetrb.org. That's Montana Echo Tango Romeo Bravo.org. There will be a button that says submit or something along those lines. It's bright and yellow, so you won't miss it. There's going to be a brief form for you to fill out. It should take you no longer than 2 minutes. And then at the end of it, you will click another button, and that will not only send your information to us, it will also give you 2 documents, a dossier and a guide. This will contain all of the information that you need in order to make a full submission to our review board. Generally speaking, if you've gone through a phase 1 and you have your investigator's brochure and your phase 1 results, everything that you're going to need is going to be contained within those, assuming that your treatment protocol, which you want to do, is approximately the same as what you did in your phase 1, right? Now, after that, you will get a call from me personally, and we will sit down, talk about your needs, and I will walk you through the process. But what we can and cannot bring to the table for you is the following. We can bring all of the knowledge that you're going to need in terms of how you can do this, how you can submit to our ETRB, and what they're going to want to see and what the process looks like and how you can do all of this compliantly. And we can also bring to the table some ability to put you in touch with the actual physical clinic side that you're going to need in terms of a partner who is specifically licensed to actually administer or prescribe your treatments. What we can't bring to the table for you is things like, large amounts of funding. You will kind of be expected to figure out the funding for getting your manufacturing up and running for yourself. We can't necessarily ahead of time answer every single question about what our review board is going to want to see in terms of your trial structure, though it's an iterative process. It's not submit and then fail and then start from scratch. It's submit and then over several weeks there will be conversations between you and our review board to iterate on things. So it's okay if you don't get everything right the very first time. And what we can't do is guarantee that any given clinic will agree to the terms that you want. It is still going to be up to you to negotiate that final deal with them. But ultimately, the entire process from beginning to end, even in a very long case, shouldn't take much more than 30 days. And once you have been approved by our review board, you are licensed to treat using your treatment protocol at any licensed ETC throughout the state. And it's our goal to have a number of partners who we will get you in with day one in terms of at least having those conversations.
Yeah, and let's also be very specific who is, for whom that's most applicable, right? So we have learned, so in the state law, by state law, you need to have passed a phase 1 trial, right? So that is a pretty clear gate. This can be under an active IND, an active investigation, or not, but it has phase 1 or equivalent safety data from another jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Right. So we're talking with companies from other jurisdictions like Japan or France, for example, that are currently not under a US IND. And that can be a very valuable and very powerful pathway. So can you speak a bit more about who, especially right now, this is kind of a deal for, maybe also which treatment areas? Because there is still potential limitations when it comes to, for example, the in-state manufacturing requirement and things like that.
Yeah, so if you want to come to Montana, here's a few things that I think might disqualify you. If you're going to be any sort of surgically implanted device, frankly speaking, I doubt that the infrastructure here will be built out to service you. I would love to have that kind of stuff here, but ETCs, these are the experimental treatment centers, the actual clinics that handle the administration, have to be built out wholesale. They can't share the use of resources with another facility. And so that kind of prevents a lot of surgical activity from going on. And I think you can almost think of it as like a spectrum where the easier the administration of your treatment is, the easier it's going to be for us to find you a clinic or a center partner. We have some treatments which are just take-home prescriptions. They're pills or they're topicals or something like that. Super easy. Any treatment center could do that. We have some which require hanging an IV bag or doing injections in the clinic. It's a little bit more difficult, but it's still not particularly challenging. And then we have in some cases things where there need to be rooms built out with specific power requirements for specific devices, and those are going to require more training and maybe some specialization. That's not impossible, but it starts to get a little bit more difficult. Not every single center is going to be able to carry that stuff. So you can kind of think of it as this spectrum where the easier it is to administer the treatments, like the literal physical process of putting the treatment into a patient, the easier it's going to be for us to find you a partner. I would say that that's probably the most relevant bottleneck for biotechs and device manufacturers generally.
Yeah, what about the in-state manufacturing requirement? Do companies that have to come to Montana need to manufacture in the state of Montana?
Not necessarily, but there's some nuance to that. So there's federal law and there's state law, and federal law does supersede state law. Now, if you were to come to Montana and just use the state law with no federal compliance strategy, then I would say that you would probably be best off trying to do as much of your manufacturing as possible in Montana. For the simple reason that the moment that you don't, you are now entering interstate commerce territory, and thus FDA jurisdiction kind of looms over your head. However, there are other steps that you can take supplementing your state level compliance strategy with a federal compliance strategy, which is something that we it was like pulling teeth, but we did finally manage to get some information from the FDA on how to do that, enough for us to give what we think is pretty concrete advice on how to structure things. And if you do pursue those strategies, or if you just have a high level of risk tolerance, then you can manufacture interstate, possibly even internationally, and use that treatment in Montana.
Yeah, exactly. So there is an interesting parallel that hopefully could happen at some point, that would make this a bit easier, which is sort of, if you want to talk a bit more about the history of state right to try and the implicit federal enforcement discretion on it, and what could potentially change with more explicit enforcement discretion, right? So that's
Yeah.
kind of a direct analogy to what you've experienced also in cannabis before.
Yeah, actually, the analogy is very, very on point. So, if you look at the history of right to try at a state level, the first law, as far as I can tell, was signed by Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado in 2014, right? Shortly after that, 2015, a bunch more states, most notably Texas, also began passing their own state right to try laws. And people started noticing, and I mean like commentators, regulators, just sort of intellectuals, again, in that sort of FDA sphere, and also policymakers, that despite all of this activity being technically federally illegal, the FDA and HHS weren't actually going after anybody using these state laws, right? Or if they were, they really weren't being very public about it at all. All of this kind of came to an inflection point. Sorry, can you mute?
Sorry.
That's okay. All of this kind of came to an inflection point with a man named Dr. Delpasand, who was using Texas's right to try law to treat a number of patients who had cancer using a drug called like Lu-177. He treated 78 patients who would otherwise have probably died. And then not only did he do so, and not only did his case kind of go viral for what the equivalent was in 2015, but he then went in front of Congress and actually testified to this. So it's more or less impossible that the FDA was not aware of this. Now, FDA is not legally required to go after every case where someone violates a federal law. They have the authority to exercise something called enforcement discretion, which is where they basically say, okay, this was technically against the letter of the federal law, but we're not going to prioritize this. We're just going to kind of ignore it. And it became pretty obvious to everyone that they were actively exercising enforcement discretion towards these state laws, probably for various kind of political capital reasons. In 2016, Senator Ron Johnson then called representatives from HHS and FDA to testify to this fact. They gave him kind of non-answers. One of them didn't show up, and the other one said, I can't comment on what our enforcement stance might be. And he also sent a letter to FDA asking very explicitly, would they go after physicians or manufacturers using these state laws? And that letter, even, I think like 10 years later, still has never been answered, right? However, if you look at the more than decade-long history at this point of FDA action against companies using state right to try laws, there has been effectively none. And this is like over about a dozen years. And in our meeting with the FDA, we asked them for this, and they did confirm that according to their own records, they had never actually gone after a company utilizing a state right to try law explicitly on the basis of doing so. They will go after you using a state right to try law if you have like manufacturing issues or if you make misleading claims. But it's quite clear that there is this unwritten or implicit rule where they are exercising enforcement discretion, and they will not go after a company purely on the basis of utilizing a state law, right? Now, this is enough that we've already seen some companies are willing to say, okay, maybe they won't own up to what their policy is, but this is about as clear as a policy can ever be while staying unwritten. We think that's enough for us to come to Montana, right? And we're just going to count on this trend continuing. We're going to take that regulatory risk. There are other companies who say like all of that is well and good, but you know what? We really cannot justify using one of these state programs until we get something explicit out of FDA. And then in the middle of that, there is like a larger group of companies that maybe don't need something explicit, but at least need a strong hint or a strong signal out of FDA and HHS that they can come to Montana. And some of the more like unwritten or implicit stuff that we've gotten from FDA and HHS recently has served that function. But the promise of a more explicit enforcement discretion policy and what it could do in terms of bringing companies to Montana is that a lot of the companies we talk to who make like life-saving treatments, things for like very rare diseases or things for cancer, they're all waiting on that explicit go-ahead. And there are patients who we can demonstrably show would be able to access this treatment and potentially save their own lives if there was an explicit go-ahead, if there was an explicit enforcement discretion policy from FDA and HHS. That's kind of the promise of an actual broader, let's say, Q-star policy. But we'll have to see. Politics is uncertain outcomes on uncertain timelines. And so at least for now, we proceed based on what we currently have in hand.
Yeah. Yeah, it was also my impression that eventually the FDA would have to say something about it, especially if these laws are more widely used, and we're planning to make that happen. And we're also the earlier they do that, the better, because there's something very important that you have observed in your career in cannabis, and that I think is kind of a plausible risk to the idea of right to try or expanded access or any early clinical access for that matter, which is adverse selection, right? So right now, when these state level programs kind of exist in a bit of a gray zone, right? So how do federal laws apply or don't apply? That attracts providers that are comfortable taking kind of a bit of a gray market risk, right? Versus when you talk about sort of more credentialed providers or providers with a larger pipeline at stake and more capital, they will have general counsels and attorneys that won't let them do that, right? Or boards that won't let them do that. So you do have this situation where then as a result, it's just more likely that something bad happens. And when something bad happens, then the whole premise of everything is in question. And then we don't really explore the right alternatives to what is currently simply a process that is too slow and leading for patients to go abroad and for clinical trials to go abroad, right? So what we can do, and we see that pretty clearly from the numbers we have, we can probably triple or quadruple the number of companies and probably also by extension the amount of funding that they can attract if there is more of that federal clarity. And I think this will also ensure, and we've seen it in the Montana law, there is oversight, right? So you need to be registered with the clinic, with the state. The state can take away the license. There's adverse events reporting. There is oversight through the ETRB by clinicians and by scientists, right? So all that data exists and is auditable. And one feature that's really powerful about this in the Montana rules is that the review boards are required to annually publish safety and outcome data in an aggregated, anonymized way. So what it does is it can bring these things, early access programs, right, to try. The FDA sort of doesn't like it that much because they perceive it as kind of outside of their system, right? So they don't get to see or access the data and things like that. Same as what you currently see with peptides, right? Also very gray market. What this program does, it makes it visible, right? It makes us get the data, and it makes us get the data into what can be used into a pipeline that can be used for public health decisions. So that's why I really think there is a really big value proposition here for the FDA and for public health of the American public in general, for that matter.
Yeah, and to make the adverse selection thing a little bit more concrete, I think you can look at the stem cell markets, the state level stem cell markets in particular. So this was my personal experience with, like, let's say, trying to go to Utah. I was trying to access the treatment from a company that was, I think, at the time in like phase 2 and has since gone to phase 3 and has been given fast track status. That was a stem cell based treatment that was based in Salt Lake City. I could not access their treatment under the state level stem cell law, but I could have driven about 11 minutes down the road from their headquarters to a place called the Relife Clinic that would have injected a proprietary mix of who knows what directly into my spine. So you can see this. The provider who had years and years and years of clinical data, the one who I should have been pushed towards if I was seeking something pre-approval, looked at these state level markets and said, there's no clearance from the FDA. It's too regulatory risky. We're not going to like jeopardize our entire clinical pipeline on this. We're not going to participate. We're not going to treat patients. But it's not like the demand to access that treatment went away, right? So someone stepped up to fill that demand, and it's a partner who, it's a clinic who has no clinical data behind their treatment. They don't really bother reporting things to the FDA. Why would they? What's their incentive? They don't care what the FDA says because, okay, send us a warning letter, send us a fine. We'll shut down and open a new clinic 30 days later, and we've got the state government backing us. And, generally speaking, it doesn't look like you guys have what it takes to come pick a fight over the use of state laws anyways. So you can see that there is this proliferation of like the worst kind of adverse selection possible. All of the providers that you should want providing pre-approval access will look at some of these state level markets, and absent guidance like the kind we can bring them now because we actually bothered to engage the FDA, they just won't participate. But on the other hand, all of the providers that you should least want participating, gray market guys with no data, with no adverse event escalation or reporting structure, with none of that, they are rising up to fill the gaps, and Americans are going to them for treatment. And this is what happens when the FDA just remains silent on this issue. They don't have any policy whatsoever. Well, in that kind of ambiguity, you're not going to see sophisticated market participation. You're just going to see market participation from people who just don't care one way or the other. They have like essentially complete regulatory risk tolerance because they just don't care about the regulations at all. Now, that's a problem for patients because they're getting substandard treatment. It's a problem for the sophisticated participants because they could be generating valuable data and they're not. And it's, frankly speaking, a problem for the FDA because there's this growing trend of like medical practice and pre-approval access, which is just proliferating outside of their jurisdiction because the political reality is they're not going to go pick a fight with a bunch of companies using state laws, but at the same time, they're also providing no pathway by which the kind of participants they should want can actually come into those state laws. And so, they're kind of at an inflection point. I do think this issue has reached critical mass where it is increasingly obvious to everyone that silence and non-action is not a viable continual path. How they're going to resolve that, it remains to be seen. We think that the way is for them to actually put out clear guidance that shows here is how you participate. And at much, much expense, we have managed to get some of that from them, although for obvious reasons, we'll keep it to ourselves as a trade secret. But they really should be coming out and putting out more explicit guidance for everyone in order to fix this problem before it just spirals out of control. And to go back to the historical stuff, a lack of willingness to comment was what was used as the onus to pass that first federal right to try legislation, which they hate, right? They hate it because it's out of their control. All they are doing is setting themselves up for the exact same outcome. If they keep ignoring these issues, if they keep ignoring this proliferation, and if it becomes too obvious to everyone that they are exercising enforcement discretion while kind of refusing to acknowledge that they're doing it, all that's going to happen is some senators are just going to say, okay, we're going to pass another right to try bill, this one around stem cells, and then we're going to pass another one around personalized treatments, which is Harshbarger and Johnson. It's already making its way through the Hill. And FDA kind of wants to maintain that monopoly status, but when it comes time to take those hard positions on these politically inconvenient issues, they just don't have the spine to do it. No pun intended. It's up to them to choose. Do they want to be proactive? Do they want to be engaging with state level partners? Or do they want to set themselves up for another whole batch of right to try bills and slowly see their own monopoly status and their own actual enforcement capability degraded through legislation?
Yeah. And I want to drive a very important message home here, right? So, and I'm really glad that the media got it right this time, right? So the Montana framework, SB535, is very far from the Wild West, right? And like unregulated or biohacking or whatever, right? So this was kind of a bit the headline in like a Wall Street Journal article from last year ago, which was otherwise actually a pretty good article, just a bit, it was a bit headliney. But there was another article that said, all right, Montana goes Wild West. But what it actually does, it is a very tightly regulated model, right? There needs to be, and we'll get to talking about that a bit more, there's a special license for a clinic, right? And if the clinic messes up and it needs to have a medical director and all of that, then the state can take away their license, right? And the clinic license is also quite expensive, right? So it's not something that you can very cheaply or easily get. Actually, I wish it would be a bit easier. And then you need an independent experimental treatment review board, ETRB, right? Independent from the clinic and of the biotech, the manufacturer. So you already have 3 different providers where you have checks and balances, right? The ETRB is a key function there. It has some oversight. And it is in turn also under the authority, finally, of Montana State, right? So there is a backstop, right? But at the same time, the regulatory work is done to a large extent by market mechanisms. And that, I think, is the real what's so exciting about Montana, right? Because as I've learned over the course of the last couple of years, including here in Prospera, but also with the topic of regulations in general, is that sophisticated businesses want regulation, right? Because what it does, it creates assurance for them. It creates insurability to them, right? It introduces a predictability that makes it insurable, right? So the fact it was really lucky for us that Montana modeled ETRBs very closely after IRBs, Federal Institutional Review Board, because that made the insurance company basically say, all right, this is the same risk. I'm used to this. So, and this is really, again, also the opportunity for the FDA. It's not needing kind of to, it is something that is ultimately something that I think that benefits public health and evidence generation in general, for that matter, right? So I've sort of seen or experienced in those discussions, that's what they care about, right? So they don't necessarily against the idea that patients should have informed consent to try things. There's a bit of this paternalistic instinct, but when you talk to sophisticated people in Washington, D.C. and FDA, what they really care about is the data, the evidence. We need to have a functioning system, clinical trials, placebo-controlled trials, and things like that, that helps us really understand what works and what doesn't, what's safe and what isn't. Right? If we don't have that, that's kind of our moat as a market in the United States, right? And the most powerful drug market in the world still, right? So we need to have a proper, we need to have an engine or need to generate evidence. And I think that's really the first program of its kind on at least the state right to try side that does that, right? That's what I think makes it ultimately so scalable. But what I ultimately want to get to as well, we haven't talked much about that, is, well, what is the opportunity here for clinicians, right? So for someone who wants to set up a clinic or a medical doctor, physician who's interested in treating patients, how do they do it, and what's the value proposition for them?
Yeah, so I mean, there's the obvious value proposition of like there's a ton of patient demand and there's only so many facilities that are willing to treat them, so you could come here and start a very lucrative business for yourself, right? However, there's maybe like a second broader demand or like more nuanced demand that I've heard a few clinicians express interest in, which is actually the potential to submit your own treatment protocols and to submit things that you see is working. So I'll give you a concrete example. I spoke to a professor of neurosurgery who was interested in particular glioblastoma cancer vaccine. And in a conversation with him, what he expressed was like, listen, I'm so utterly convinced that this particular treatment would function better as part of a combination therapy, which in my current practice, I cannot actually prescribe because federal right to try and expanded access and all of these things are not flexible enough. My university that I work with is not flexible enough, but I'm convinced that like this would be a better option for patients. Well, in Montana, he can submit a treatment protocol for a combination therapy, right? So long as both of those therapies are post phase 1, he can come forward and argue, hey, here is our informed consent process. Here is, our reason to think that this is at least sensible from like a risk benefit perspective. This is my treatment protocol, and I want you guys to approve this so that I can treat patients with it in Montana. That's the kind of flexibility that you can get in Montana for like $12,000. If you tried to do that same thing with the FDA, you would probably be looking at a price tag of closer to $1 million, right? So this is something where if you're a clinician and maybe there's just like flexible options that you want to pursue because you think they're better for your patients. Maybe it's just something where like the price tag for a lot of these things are too high if you go through your existing system. Montana is that option for you. And again, all of it you can do while, running a lucrative business, while making a profit, which is what's needed, again, for all of this to be economically scalable and sustainable so that we can actually get this stuff to patients and it doesn't just all look good in theory to, regulators and people who give comments in stat news, right? This is something that actually works from a boots on the ground perspective, from the perspective of someone starting a business, from the perspective of someone trying to bring treatment to a lot of patients. And I think that does matter to a lot of physicians who are just in this terrible position where they're looking at patients who are going to die and they know they could help, but there's just some bureaucrat or some rule stopping them from doing so.
Yeah. I also think in general, and I heard that a few times, physicians are interested. There's a bit of more of a movement towards independent practice and cash pay models, just simply because Medicare and Medicaid gets like very restrictive and increasingly sort of not let dictating options to doctors instead of making them sort of independent minded practitioners, right? Because all you have to do is reducing liability and risk. Right. So this is also a model that has a clear liability and risk framework attached to it. So, and it's very flexible when it comes to cash pay. Right. So I think that's that's what I also found many physicians may be interested in. Right. So let's talk a bit more. So what do we we are looking for more clinicians, right? We are looking for more companies or more physicians to set up ETCs here. So do you want to talk a bit more about that and what we're looking for? Where do you see opportunities in sort of for people that are listening to, ask their friends or look into their network who could be a fit for helping us?
Yeah, on the clinic side, I'd say that there's a few opportunities. One, if you're a Montana licensed physician, especially if you have an already existing facility out here, even if it's just something as simple as like an exam room and like an office and a bathroom, that's valuable and you can get started very easily. So please reach out to us, if that's the case. The second thing is even if you're not a Montana licensed physician, if you're a specialist, we've already seen a few cases where biotechs have come to us and said, okay, like I want to submit, but I want to see that there's a clinic up and running who has this particular kind of specialist, like not even as their medical director, but like on staff, available to consult with patients as needed. So there's opportunities to come in as a consulting physician from that side, and really, get involved with some pretty cool stuff. Sorry, could you mute? Uh, yeah, get involved with some pretty cool stuff, be on the cutting edge of treatment, and maybe just become more aware of things that the average person in your field is never going to hear about. So, these are some of the best options for clinicians interested in entering the space.
Okay, so we did have quite a bit of media coverage the last 2 weeks or so since the rules got adopted by Montana. There's one larger piece by the Information, and there's one larger piece by the MIT Technology Review. So what's your takeaway been from the media coverage? What do you think they got right or what might they have gotten wrong?
Yeah, I think it was relatively balanced media coverage, right? So you see like the Information, it's a lot of patient perspective, it's a lot of biotech perspective, and then it's of course like the required perspective of like some university professor talking about like his concerns, right? Which is, I think, more or less what you are needed to do as like a reputable journalist. In terms of the MIT guys, I mean, we were warned that they tend to be like a bit sensationalist, and they called like the ETRB like a rubber stamp, which of course it's not. But at the end of the day, I think that it all did come out relatively fair. I think there is a gut instinct from journalists to cast patients as like desperate, like out of their minds, unable to make like informed decisions, which I think is just unrealistic. Especially with like rare disease patients, I often find that they are far more informed about their choices than anyone short of like maybe a doctor that's been studying that particular disease for like 15 years. Um, but overall, I feel pretty good about everything. We'll see how they all cover it when we start to generate valuable data, when patients are talking about how helpful it's been to them, and of course, when inevitably something does go wrong, right? We'll see how all of that shakes out. But so far, I've been pretty encouraged by the willingness to at least present both sides of the story.
Yeah, I've also been very positively impressed by the coverage. So, as I mentioned before, it's not, biohacking and whatever, right? So it is a very credible option. We have a very credible review board with Matt Caberline, Felipe Sierra, Jamie Justice, right? Which was very intentional, right? So because we don't want to make shortcuts, we want to create a model that creates and inspires credibility. And I think that was recognized by the media, despite a couple of these scare quotes and sort of the general sort of tendency to believe. I call it the model that patients are dumb and companies are greedy model, and federal regulators and the government are angels. That's very often the mental model, but reality is very nuanced, right? So nobody's perfect, right? So almost any party in the world are self-interested actors. So the question really of good regulations or good governance is how do you how do you maximize the potential for good actors to do as much good as they can? And good actors means even they could be doing it for self-interested motives to build large companies, because if they build large companies, they can treat a lot of patients, and to minimize the potential for harm from bad actors, right? So what this is a model to do exactly that in a more nuanced way, in a less one size fits all way than what we currently have, right? So you mentioned rare disease patients, for example. What is the alternative right now? Right, 95% of rare disease patients don't have any treatment. And developing a new treatment, despite many efforts and accelerated approval pathways and the Orphan Drug Act and all of that, still takes a very, very long time and is very, very expensive. And then there's something that is sort of the problem of the one size fits all approach. So we are for right to try and for patients to take new drugs under informed consent. But then the problem is when the FDA gives it the rubber stamp, then it's under insurance coverage, right? And when it's covered by insurance, especially in the US model where you have free price setting power and market exclusivity after for up to 7 years, right? The drug company that gets a rare disease treatment approved, which is the only option really for many patients because so few companies are able to carry those costs, then then the taxpayer, CMS, has to pay $2 million per treatment for that patient. And there is 7-year market exclusivity. And the drug has been approved on limited data, right? So that is just not optimal. And that is not good. It leads to, and there has been evidence by actually groups of people, including Aaron Kesselheim, who has been coming out as a skeptic in that piece, that I agree with, right? The FDA is actually in many ways not rigorous enough on some of these approvals, but you can also completely understand it from the patient side. And maybe it's even better to approve it because these patients otherwise don't have any other options, right? So there is kind of a double whammy of the pressure that the FDA is under, right? So you can be too strict and you can be too lax, right? So that's why it needs alternative like that. And that's a very nuanced conversation, right? I don't expect anyone like in the media to necessarily, well, they should look a bit deeper into some, of the approvals. But ultimately something that we have to prove that this can be an alternative, right? So, and judge us by the results, right? Judge us. The process, the way it's designed, is very transparent, and we've not been sort of hiding how we go about things and what our principles are, right? So on the ETRB website, you can very clearly see a document with our governance principles and can very clearly see also, who is who's comprising the review board and what are kind of the relationships with Infinita, the company, and the remuneration. So we're very open, very transparent about that. So judge us by our results. That would be my ask from the media.
Yeah, getting into the whole the FDA is too strict and too lax at the same time thing. We spent, I'm going to say like something like 6 or 7 months, like going through Washington, D.C., talking to senators, House reps, people on help, people in the FDA. And there was like a good learning there, I think, at like the reality of the situation that the FDA finds themselves in. Because, I see this all the time from like bioethics commentariat people is like, oh, the FDA shouldn't be political. The FDA shouldn't be political. That's such a ridiculous thing to say. It's like, dude, the FDA's leadership is nominated by the president and voted on by the senators. Like their bosses are politicians, right? The FDA's budget every year is authorized by politicians, right? Like the FDA is currently stanced as like the monopoly gatekeeper between every sick American and medicine. This is an inherently political role to occupy. And you can go into the FDA and be like someone who's going to like stand tall on your principles and like, we're not going to compromise our standards and all of that. And then you know what happens? You do something like Unicure, where there's a ton of people whose like family members are going to die if they don't get this medicine, and you try to uphold those standards, like Renee Prasad and Tracy Beth Hoag did, and then like an army of the world's most sympathetic and also like highly motivated people go marching around the hill, telling every senator and House rep and person who works for the White House that they can get a hold of that they need to get rid of you personally as soon as possible. Like that needs to be a top priority. And then what happens is you get fired and you get replaced with someone who is willing to play the political game. And this is all downstream of the FDA having a monopoly status, not only over that like broader approval for like Medicare and insurance coverage, but also over whether you can access treatment pre-approval generally. If you want for the FDA to be in a position where they're not constantly getting hounded by patients and patient advocacy groups that are like pressuring them to make political decisions, then you have to relax the like vice grip that the FDA has over pre-approval access generally. And this is where I actually think, I'm not sure if we can convince anybody of the FDA at that today, but I think that maybe at some point someone will realize, oh, wait, if Montana had been operational when that whole Unicure thing was happening, no one would have been able to come and argue that we were killing patients because we would have been able to point to an economically viable and scalable solution for pre-approval access that these patients could have gotten, right? I think it's going to be a few years before we see somebody at the FDA who is actually capable of putting all of that together and also just dealing with politicians. Like, even if they are capable of putting it all together, will they be willing to say that is an entirely separate thing. But it is an argument. Like, there are ways that actually reducing kind of the monopoly status of the FDA may work in its benefit in terms of being able to make actual informed decisions instead of political decisions with what it maintains control over.
Yeah, it's like the argument that the FDA shouldn't be political, but then also they're only political if your side is not in power, right?
Yep.
So when your side is in power, then these are all independent scientific experts and all that.
Yeah.
And when it's the other side, it's in power, then it's captured by political interests, right? So I just one learning that I have in DC is just like all these different interest groups and political factions. They're all looking at the elephant from a different angle, but are just not seeing the whole picture,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah. And something, it's also just like, I think that this was one big shift in how I think of, regulators is I think I used to think of it as like the FDA, right? Like it's a single organism. And then you get to DC and you realize like there is no single organism. There is like a loose like label. I really like Yarvin's whole like cathedral idea, right? There's this like fuzzy network of interests that intersect under this label. But at the end of the day, the best way to mentally model anyone that you're dealing with is as an individual. And when you're dealing with bureaucrats, the first concern that any individual has is saving their own ass, right? It's making sure that they never get in trouble. It's making sure that they can just keep pulling in that like nice fat paycheck in this like prestigious job where there's all these people who like will constantly be kissing your butt. And maybe one day they'll even be in line for like a commissioner position or a department head position if they just keep their head down, and don't piss anybody off. And the easiest way for any of them to achieve that is to just not make any decisions whatsoever, right? It's not make the right decisions. It's just don't do anything at all. Don't rock the boat. Try to find some reason why it's someone else's problem or it needs to go through some other mechanism or, oh, I can't comment on that directly, right? Submit us a citizen's petition, which we will never respond to, right? This is just sort of the standard mode of operation for not even just the FDA, but like all bureaucrats. But it's exactly why, like, when that comes in contact with people for whom that silence is actively preventing access to medicine, like, you just get these enormous firestorms of political attention. And at some point, people in the FDA are going to need to realize if I want to keep that job security, I'm either going to have to make decisions, which they don't want to do, or I'm going to have to let someone else make the decision. And this is where some of the states are going to, I think, end up having like a role that ends up being politically useful for them.
Yeah. So I want to talk a bit about that model to adopt innovative regulation in states first and then scaling it to other states and eventually, hopefully, to the federal level. I just want to do like a very quick mental bookmark or note that if you're interested in sort of the FDA too strict or too lax argument, there's a really good Scott Alexander article about the Aduhelm approval, right? So that was an Alzheimer drug that turned out to be based on a flawed hypothesis, and there was a very clear political overruling of the advisory committee that actually Aaron Kesselheim, who criticized us, was on and resigned in protest over that decision. Right? So, if Aaron Kesselheim ever listens to this, we agree with your decision there. I think you did the right thing. Right? And I think this is kind of where rigor is correctly placed. But again, in political decisions, rigor is selectively placed. Right? It's selective rigor for different interests in your political side, as it is often in law. But check out that article, Adumbrations of Aducanumab. I put a link in the description, and also just a bookmark that it seems that many sort of foundational moments or theses of my career go back to a Scott Alexander article. Right? So back then it was the article about Prospera, and now it turns out to be that article about Aduhelm. But now I want to talk a bit about the model with US states, right? So as far as I know, there's very few groups like us who are pursuing that model. We're not the only one, right? So there is Cicero, for example, Joe Lonsdale's group. They're very good at that. They're regularly passing laws at the state level, for example, on AI healthcare, and then kind of using that as a model to also inspire federal legislation. And I think there's something about this model that hasn't been tried yet, right? So we've been attracted to this because each of our different backgrounds has led us to it, right? So in your case, the work you did before in cannabis. In my case, the sort of the Prosper and Special Economic Zone model approach, right? So if you want to change things like large institutions, you need to have a way to start small, right? So don't reform IBM, start a startup. And then eventually through the process of startups and through competition, the large organization is also forced to adapt by just showing a better way, right? But almost all of DC is kind of shoehorning itself into, like, you can point out all these detailed problems, and these are smart people and sophisticated people, you'd agree with them on the facts, and you'd get them to admit, right, there's a problem here. And yes, we should change like the regulations and the laws around that. We need to reform things. But then you go through, all right, have you ever tried federal legislation, especially with Congress being what it is now? This is nearly impossible, right? So there's entire careers going by that try that for all their careers without being able to, right? We're also experiencing and seeing how difficult it is even to change the rulemaking process in these federal agencies, which is all great, right? So if they do the right thing, then that has a very large effect. And I would really welcome that if the FDA does the right thing and we're changing the regulations the right way. But just all our experience the last couple of decades should indicate that the likelihood of that is just very, very low at a very, very high cost. Now, and that's where the states come in, right? And that was kind of also the original idea of the United States and sort of the laboratories of governance or of democracy, right? Which sounds a bit like a cliche at this point, but I think it's actually not been tried, right? And that's, I think, a very interesting twist on the interstate commerce clause, right? Which is, I don't want to go too deep into the rabbit hole, but libertarians know that was kind of how much of the federal regulation is started justified on. And what actually tried to do, the original interstate commerce clause, is prevent the states from going to trade wars with each other. So it tried to prevent the states from doing restrictive regulations that would sort of undermine the free economic flow of commerce. Now, this is actually kind of what we're trying to do, and what we've actually also seen just from a deeper Claude analysis of preemption cases against states over the last couple of decades. Like more than 87% of federal preemption cases are actually against states that are restrictive, right? Especially in politically charged subjects like abortion and things like that. Or very often there's kind of a freak out about some new FDA approved medication or product, and the states want to ban it, right? Because, new medication always freaks people out. Now, that is not a precedent that the feds and many of the large pharma companies can let fly, right? Because it would lead to all sorts of bad precedent. They went through this very expensive and time-consuming federal approval. It's not that the states can then restrict it. But, and I think that's also a bit the structural explanation why we see enforcement discretion by the FDA on these things, and Big Pharma not really being negative about it in any kind of way, is that it's a more permissive regulatory way at the state level, right? So more permissive preemption cases in more permissive cases are much rarer. They're only 13% of the preemption cases. So I think there's actually a really big opportunity for states that want to bring business, right? So if you want to bring business, if you want to make laws, and especially now with the Chevron overturn, another rabbit hole, but the opportunity right now is really ripe for states, right? So if you want to bring data centers to your state, if you want to bring crypto to your state, if you want to bring nuclear power plants to your state, if you want to bring biotech to your state, there's actually, you can actually just do things, right? The federal appetite to restrict these things is not that high. Like, we're in America after all, and we're proud of the legacy of it being the country of innovators and of entrepreneurs. So I do feel this might actually be surprising if you start trying that at state levels, and even having some of these discussions at the federal level, that I think there is, despite some skepticisms you encounter, but I do think it's actually something that is something very deeply American, and even people who are not immediately like for it or skeptical are kind of seeing or feeling that spirit a bit, right? So it's not something that's like all the way the Wild West, but it's actually to create a new an institutional synthesis, right? It's still within what America is or has been trying to create. I'm not sure if you want to comment on any of that.
No, I mean, I agree with the idea of translating state progress into like impetus for broader reform. And I also agree with the idea of states being sort of the laboratories of democracy. But I will say that, you need to, if I think of like the whole right to try and state pre-approval access stuff, I think we have two kind of good contradictory examples. One would be the sort of state right to try laws, and then another would be like the state stem cell markets. So state right to try laws, for all that we do have some success stories like Dr. Del Passant, and there are other success stories where people have been like less public about it, but there are folks doing like economic activity and treatment activity under state right to try laws. However, you have not seen that much adoption of those laws. And the reason was because like you're dealing with a highly regulated industry that had other paths, and you're asking them to take regulatory risks, but then the states did not really provide any sort of support to help justify those risks. And the market wasn't large enough to justify those risks, right? Now compare that with the state stem cell laws, where like, yeah, there was some regulatory risk, but for a lot of these companies, there wasn't really another viable pathway. Very few of them could, potentially get like, clinical approval. And so, you still had that enormous amount of demand. You didn't really need the state subsidization to come in. You still saw like huge proliferation and huge growth of like stem cell clinics in like Florida and Utah for all the good and all the bad that does, right? All I would say to a state regulator, listening to this is like, you need to be a little bit sober. Is your state regulation by itself really going to be enough to like jumpstart that economic activity, the actual build out of like the actual infrastructure, the brick and mortar facilities that you need, the boots on the ground, making things happen? Or do you need to also add in like a little bit of startup capital, throw a little bit of gasoline on that fire, maybe some sort of like grants program or something, right? Some actual capital that people can tap to get that stuff. I think Montana is not going to be the kind of place where the state or anybody needs to step in and provide that capital. But, I think you can also look at other bits of history and see that there's been a lot of state laws like state right to try laws that all looks good on paper. And then the impetus for those laws was translated into the federal right to try law. And then no real adoption of either happened because it was done by a lot of like think tank people and a lot of regulatory people who just look at the realities on paper and never actually do the dirty work down here in the mud with the rest of us, like getting care to patients, right? And so I just caution everybody on the regulatory side, like don't just look at the paper, look at the actual history of adoption, talk to the actual people doing the boots on the ground work, which I know you won't, and then, work from that. But in the meantime, we all exist to actually make things happen and then work around the terrible decisions that you make.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very big challenge to do that kind of lift. I mean, we have very specific backgrounds that enable us to do this, right? I have a background in policy, and then later learned the entrepreneurship and business side, and as have you, right? So your business was dependent basically on policy, right, and on laws that were and how they were interpreted. So I do, however, encourage anyone who's listening and who's excited about what we're talking about and want to make their mark. Like if you have the business experience, you have something very valuable for policymakers, right? So policymakers lack that perspective, right? So DC is very self-centered, and they're not getting sort of and that's the mistake that businesses make when they interact with policymakers, right? That's what I see. Others that are sort of lobbying for legislative change in DC from the business side make that mistake all the time. They see things too narrowly from their interest and vantage point, right? So they want to get something done that benefits them, right? So, which is fine. Like as a business, you're trained to think that way. But first of all, that is to some degree illegal, right? So you can't get a policy change just to fit you and yourself, right? So the law is a public good, right? So it is something that is accessible to anyone. And we have problems with special interests and how they do things, but you could just not blanket and go in there and ask for something that really just benefits you. So that means you need to think of the bigger picture, right? So policymakers, for good and bad, have or need to or are required or asked to have that bigger picture, right? So the problem is not that they have that. The problem is that they don't get sort of the nuanced and detailed feedback from business and what it means for implementation. And as a result, they actually have a very limited view of what that big picture means when it's translated into practice, right? So that means, when you're an entrepreneur, then you just want to have that kind of conversation with policymakers, with state legislators, and the other way around, right? So if you're in that kind of position, you want to, and if you're in biotech specifically, we can help you with that. And I've seen that's actually something that attracted a lot of the state legislators and also federal policymakers to meet with us, because we could give them a lot of business feedback, right? It was just not really just us coming and saying, this is what we want. And we did that too. And we have like a very specific ask that we have. But we're also here as 10 CEOs of biotech companies, some even public, some startups. And they can give you the feedback directly from the horse's mouth, right? Which then also helps them, right? So, there's many policymakers that want to do the right thing, especially if they're early in their career and naive, but nevertheless want to and have the capability to do good things. And you can help them by giving them those kind of critical insights and inviting kind of your peers to that process as well. And after having gone through that process, I think some aspects or many aspects of sort of that lived or experienced or practiced democracy is very positive. Like you can just talk to legislators, like you can just give them a phone call, right? So they have their phone numbers public very often, and you can enter a process where you tell them what the situation of your business is, what your problems are, and then help them think of how they can potentially help you.
Yeah, agreed. Just so you know, I'm gonna run out of battery on my phone soon, so we should we should wrap up.
Okay, so let's wrap it up. Anyway, Steve, really great to have this very long exposition with you here. Is there anything else you want to draw a final, give our listeners a final call of action, where to find you, how to best connect with you?
If you want to chat with me personally, probably the best way is to contact me on X. I'm Right to Try Guy. And always interested in talking to anyone who just wants to get involved in the space. So whether you're a patient, a clinician, legislator, biotech, whatever, reach out to me.
Great. We'll wrap up with the ultimate guide to Montana SB535. Very excited for everything that's ahead, for us as a company and everyone that is part of this mission. Like, we've received really an enormous level of support that I'm very grateful for. I do really think this is like the right time to do something like this, and this could really mean a lot and do a lot for a lot of patients ultimately whose life this could save. So thank you for being on the forefront with me together on that, Steve. And thank you for everyone listening and tuning in.